What do you think about Fiendsmith White Forest since it's so splashable in everything? Look, the reality of things is that a Fiendsmith engine, it probably makes every deck better to an extent. I don't know if White Forest is the best place to put them, but you probably can. It's definitely not the best version of Fiendsmith. I don't know if it's the best White Forest version either, because they don't seem to have inherent synergies, right? But that is a topic that I wanted to talk about with you guys, is the current TCG format, and also give you guys a little bit of an update on my thoughts on like different options for the European Championship, and also where I personally stand at the moment. Like in the past, it's always been like I didn't really talk about what deck exactly I'm gonna use for a tournament. I've been giving you guys my thoughts on the format, but for this one in particular, I haven't decided yet, but I also don't feel like it is that big of a deal to know what I will be playing for the European Championship. So I'm gonna be pretty open with my thoughts on what I think I'm going to play and what I'm leaning towards at the moment. What we're about to do is not a tier list, simply because I don't feel confident ranking some of these decks between each other, right? Because I simply have been procrastinating on testing for the European Championship. It's relatively easy what deck you're going to put in, like, this is the best deck in the format category, right? That's going to be Snake Eyes, spoilers. But like everything else, I don't really know how it pairs up against each other yet and which one is slightly better than the other. So in terms of like a tier list fashion, I don't think it'd be the best information out there, like from me, because I simply haven't tested all these decks to the extent that I would like to. So instead, we're going to talk about different meta contenders after the Infinite Forbidden and my first impression and what I think of them and what I think viable approaches to this format are. Because even in a tier 0 format, there are different options you have when approaching a tournament in terms of your mindset, in terms of what you want to achieve, in terms of the deck you play to achieve that goal, right? Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. The best deck in the format is going to be Fiendsmith Snake Eye, and I've pulled up an OCG list simply because the cards are not TCG legal yet as of the day of recording this. We don't have tournament lists yet, and I don't have a TCG version of this deck yet, but it's gonna look somewhat like this. Just imagine it with all the good cards at 3: Bonfire, Wanted, and Snake Eye Ash. So you've got a plethora of good starters for this deck. It almost feels like you have too many starters to choose from, so that people are probably gonna end up playing slightly over 40 to diminish the chances of drawing like Flamberge and such. That's probably how it's gonna go. This deck is honestly a menace. It is going to be by far the best deck. In the OCG at the moment, it is sharing that top spot with yugioh Fiendsmith, which we're going to talk about in a second as well. But I think in the TCG, this deck is going to be ahead. The sheer amount of starters and extenders that it has, the board that it ends on is very close to unbreakable, I would say, because of the new Fiendsmith cards adding Omni Negates back into the mix. You've got like hand traps to back it up. You've got really solid interruption on the board. You have the field spell that can bring out an IP Masquerena even if you get like Dark Ruler or something. You've got a Promethean Princess in the graveyard. You've got the option just to like access Floodgates with Beatrice after siding. It's not a great time to be playing board breakers against this deck, but it's also not a great time to be playing hand traps against this deck, because guess what? This deck has infinite ways to play through hand traps. This is one reason why I think Necroquip Princess is probably gonna make the cut. Imagine a sequence of like normal summon Snake Eye Ash, activate Imperm, use Diabellstar, and then the Diabellstar gets Veilered or Impermed as well, right? And then you have those two bodies. Those two bodies don't turn into anything crazy if you don't play Necroquip Princess. But if you do play Necroquip Princess, you can basically translate that into the full Fiendsmith combo, right? For that reason, I think the Necroquip Princess is going to be a staple card in Snake Eyes. I would consider that staple. If I was playing a deck like Snake Eyes, which is full of normal summon and extenders, winning the comparison of I have 2 starters, or like 1 starter and 1 extender, and my opponent has 2 hand traps, and I can play through that, is insane. That's a crazy ability to have. Normally, the way it is if you have the same amount of starters / extenders, then your opponent has hand traps, you should not be ending on much. The fact that you win the 2-on-2 is insane, because statistically, people are playing decks like this, like they are currently. 2 hand traps is like such a common thing to have. This sort of stuff really makes me not want to play hand traps. What's even the point of having the second hand trap then? If you really think about it, if my opponent has a Snake Eye Ash and I have 1 hand trap and they don't have an extender, they pass. So having 1 hand trap is good sometimes if you get lucky. But what's the point of the second hand trap? My opponent uses their normal summon, I use a hand trap. They use an extender, I use a hand trap, but they still have combo. So like having 2 hand traps feels almost irrelevant. The only hand trap I guess that'd be good as a second hand trap would be maybe Ash. Then at least you can like Ash the Wanted or Ash the Bonfire, and then they don't have 2 bodies to go into Closed Moon if they don't have the 3rd extender. It's so rough. I'm just looking at this deck and I just can't spot a weakness. Maybe that's just me being unimaginative or not being able to figure it out yet. I'm trying to think of what I could do to beat this deck going second, and I just can't think of a consistent answer. It doesn't look like 2 hand traps does consistently do it, because that was the plan at German Nationals for me, for example. I was playing Melodious, and my plan was if I go second, I think 2 hand traps relatively consistently stop the Snake Eye deck. Obviously not every time, like sometimes they have Ash, Bonfire, and Witch, and then you can't stop them. But like before Infinite Forbidden, if you drew Imperm Veiler, that was usually fine. And now with Necroquip Princess, it simply isn't possible anymore. Conceptually, I think it's possible to build a Yu-Gi-Oh deck that aims to draw like 2 hand traps on average and then still gets to play on its own turn. Because if you draw like 2 hand traps on average you have 4 other cards left to play on your turn. Maybe one of those, it can be another hand trap or a duplicate or like a brick or whatever. So let's say out of those 4 cards that you have left after hand trapping them twice, you've got 3 good ones and then you can play, right? That was, for example, the idea of Melodious. The deck that I played on average opened 2 hand traps, which was fine. I don't think you can build a deck that on average draws 3 hand traps and is actually playable against like your opponent's hand traps and stuff. Because yes, you can play like 21 hand traps or something if you can even find that many good ones. Would you even draw like 3 on average then? Okay, in over 50% of my games, I draw 3. If that's what's needed to handle Snake Eyes, your deck is just not functional most of the time. Like most decks just can't operate with 2 or 3 cards left in the hand. Pearly can. Oh yeah, I would love to be playing Pearly, throw 3 hand traps at my opponent, have 3 cards left in my hand, and then my opponent is playing hand traps as well. Have fun playing through hand traps with Pearly with 3 cards where all of your cards discard a card. You can't do that. That doesn't work. You are not winning because even after 3 hand traps, your opponent doesn't end on 0. Your opponent still has like SP Lil Knight. How do you even make a deck that wants to draw 3 hand traps? I don't think you can. Yeah, maybe Tenpai. Like if I sit across a Snake Eye Duelist and I open 2 hand traps this next format, I don't expect to win that game. Like more likely than not, I'll lose. Long story short, this is the best deck of the format for the TCG with the added Wanteds and Bonfires and Snake Eye Ash. And the situation is it wins against hand traps and it wins against board breakers. The result of that is a format that is very centered around if this deck goes first, it probably wins. Personally, Snake Eyes, I don't feel like playing it, and I don't think I will for the European Championship. The first reason is, while I do care about the European Championship, obviously I would love to become the European champion one day, I personally am kind of tired of Snake Eyes. This year, out of all the years to try hard for Euros, is the one where I'm the least motivated, simply because we're already qualified for the Master Duel World Championships. I'm feeling okay for the sake of like playing a different deck that I'm gonna enjoy more, having slightly less of a chance to win. I am more inclined to play a different deck, as well as I don't even think playing Snake Eyes gives me like a great chance anyways, because the mirror matches still feel like they're very close to 50-50. If I'm going second against this deck, it doesn't really matter if I'm playing the deck myself or if I'm playing freaking a Yugi structure deck. I'm probably losing anyways. All I need to do is play a deck that's like good enough when I get to play the game, like going first and stuff like that. And the first deck that is actually relatively high up on my radar on possible options for the European Championship is the Yubel deck. I've been enjoying the Yubel cards in Master Duel recently. It's been a lot of fun for me. I want to preface that in Master Duel, the deck doesn't have Fiendsmith yet, so I think one thing that I'm probably going to be tired of relatively quickly is the Fiendsmith portion of this deck. The Fiendsmith combo is probably going to be like the new Snake Eye combo, right? Where like after a while, you'll have seen it for like the 1000th time and you're going to be kind of sick of it. But the Yubel portion of this deck is something that to me at the moment feels kind of fresh, feels like kind of a new thing. It's got some new dynamics to it. I just enjoy it more currently. Maybe that's just because like new toy syndrome, right? Haven't played it yet, while Snake Eyes has been around for a long time and I've played it and against it plenty of times. This is like the closest thing to a fun but still pretty meta deck. option, right? And so that's why I am currently, if I'm playing a Fiendsmith deck or if I'm playing one of the top tier decks, it's probably going to be yugioh. I quite like this deck. I think it's a little bit worse than the Snake Eye deck. I think it is still good enough to top or potentially win the event, and that's why I'm currently looking into this. And if I find a list that I'm happy with, this is the one that I'm probably gonna bring. Basically, those are the top two, I would say, of the upcoming formats, the two decks that utilize the Fiendsmith engine the best. Can you say why you think it's worse? Okay, so I think it's slightly worse than the Snake Eye deck because it is more normal summon reliant than a Snake Eye deck with 6 copies of Diabellstar. It's harder for this deck to get going when the normal summon gets interrupted. That also means it's slightly worse into hand traps. It's not reliant on normal summon anymore. I mean, the Fiendsmith cards help, but it still is more reliant on its normal summon than Snake Eyes, right? Because the Snake Eye deck also has Fiendsmith, but the Snake Eye deck also has Diabellstar. This deck is good. I'm not saying it's bad or anything. I'm just saying why it's worse than Snake Eyes, which is one hell of a deck to compare yourself to. Like, this deck, in terms of its card quality and the things that it can do, is insane, right? This deck does not have those kind of possibilities to extend if your normal summon gets interrupted and all that kind of stuff. The grind game is better in Snake Eyes. That is also true. Comparing anything to Snake Eyes is really, really tough because this deck is just completely insane in all aspects of Yu-Gi-Oh! Pretty much, right? In terms of starter cards, in terms of extenders, in terms of room for non-engine, all this kind of stuff. It's not a fair comparison to make. Yubel is a phenomenal deck, but it's not better than Snake Eyes. For me, it remains an option because yes, it's slightly worse. It's got some advantages in the sense that I think people are going to be preparing their decks more towards Snake Eyes. People are going to test more against Snake Eyes, and people might be inexperienced against Yubel. All things considered, I'd say Snake Eyes is the better deck. This one for me personally looks more fun though, and that in the situation that I'm in, being tired of Snake Eyes and all that kind of stuff is worth looking into for me. And then the other one that I want to mention is Tenpai. This is like the third one in this discussion that could be considered a top tier deck. I do think Tenpai is strong. Tenpai can play Shifter. Besides the Trident Dragon, this deck is definitely the most budget option. I'm not a huge fan of Tenpai, but that doesn't mean it's not a good deck, especially in the TCG where we still have 3 copies of the field spell. We basically have full power Tenpai. In the OCG, when the field spell was still at 3, I think Tenpai was actually doing really well. We also have 3 shifters, so I think Tenpai is worth looking into if you want to play a meta deck, but you are on somewhat of a budget. And now I want to talk about some other more rogue-ish options. In terms of dimension shifter decks, obviously Tenpai can play it, but I think Ritual Beast is worth an honorable mention. Other than being able to play Shifter, I personally don't think the Ritual Beast does anything exceptionally well or better than other decks. You have a couple 1-card combos, you have a couple of 2-card combos, some extenders, you have solid room for non-engine, but it's got Shifter. So going second, you at least have somewhat of a chance against the meta deck. And that makes it, I think, one of the better rogue decks. All right, and now here's where my copium comes in, right? Because I told you I'm leaning towards, or I'm thinking I'll probably end up playing the Yubel deck. But here are some things that I want to try that I have not the biggest hope of them actually being successful, but I want to look into more some of the White Forest cards. The only thing, in my opinion, that speaks for a deck like this one, what I said earlier, I think is true for all of the decks. Going second into Snake Eye Fiendsmith is gonna be basically impossible. But in that sense, it's like not that much worse than other meta decks, because like even Snake Eye itself is gonna struggle going second. But obviously runic decks are gonna be especially weak going second because they have the least amount of room for non-engine. It's a deck that I'll look into if I really enjoy it, and as long as it's consistently playing through hand traps going first, which that's what runic decks are usually good at. I think the chance that I play this at the European Championship is like 1% or something, as well as something like Ice Barrier Runics, which is also a deck that looks very, very fun. If I was to play a quote-unquote fun deck, it'd be one of those two, probably. But in general, I think that is one way you can approach this upcoming format. Basically, for me, those would be my sort of pet decks, right? Like the White Forest Runic or the Ice Barrier Runics. Those are the sort of decks that I can just play, and I know that I will enjoy them, even if I won't beat the Snake Eye deck when I go second, right? I'm not expecting that. And you can do that with whichever one of the sort of meta / rogue decks are your pet decks, right? Melodious, Branded, Voiceless, Plants, Labyrinth, Chimera, all those decks, they're still good Yu-Gi-Oh decks. They're gonna suck against Snake Eye going second, but let's be real, anything kind kind of sucks against Snake Eye going second. If you just don't feel like paying the money for the Fiendsmith cards, or you feel like the format is just not great for you, and even if you were playing Snake Eyes, you were not gonna enjoy it or something, you can still play those decks, you know? Like, you have a smaller chance of doing well, but the chance of beating Snake Eyes with these decks is not zero. It's not high, but it's not impossible, especially if you build them well and if you know them inside out, because they're your pet deck that you've played for a long time, right? In my example, if I play a Runic deck against an average Snake Eye duelist, there's always a chance that I can beat them, right? And so I think that's another thing that you can do. Play your pet decks and like kind of master them for this format, I think is not the worst approach. For example, I'm taking the OCG metagame breakdown again. While Yubel and Snake Eyes are taking up very solid chunks of the pie chart, there is a lot of other stuff, you know, at least in the OCG at the moment. We're gonna have to wait and see how this looks in the TCG, but only because they're taking up a lot of room in the pie chart does not mean they are taking up the entire pie chart. It's not the same format. It's going to be different. I think for us, Snake Eye is going to be above Yubel, and they're probably going to take up a little more than this piece of the pie, but there's going to be room for other decks. You know, the European Championship and NAWCQ top 64s are not going to be 64 Fiendsmith decks. At least I hope not. That'd be kind of crazy. I think there's room for other decks to do well, you know? Yeah, and that's where I personally stand on this upcoming Fiendsmith Snake Eye format. To have some positive words to end the discussion, I hope that the ban list in August is going to hit Snake Eyes hard. I don't expect it to hit Yubel / Fiendsmith super hard, because I do think obviously Fiendsmith is going to be an expensive card, already is an expensive card, and I don't think it's going to get hit on the ban list 1 month after its release. Maybe they will hit some stuff surrounding Fiendsmith like Beatrice or Caesar or Appaloosa, which the Yubel deck doesn't even play. Those kind of things I could imagine getting a hit, but the Fiendsmith deck directly I don't think is going to get hit. I think the Fiendsmith engine is going to be strong, but the Snake Eye deck has definitely, I feel like, been around for long enough that we can expect a severe hit to it. And so maybe that's going to make the format better, because like I said, I think the Yubel deck, while it's really powerful, has its weaknesses and is not as toxic as the Snake Eye deck. And maybe I'm just saying that because it's new. I definitely want to see the Snake Eye deck being hit, but for now, these are the approaches that I would suggest for you to use depending on where you are. You know, if you just want to try hard as much as you can, if you want to be the European champion or the NAWCQ champion and you really care, then you should probably just master Fiendsmith Snake Eyes. If you are not willing to play Snake Eyes, those are the other options, I think. For me personally, it's going to be Yubel or White Forest, probably. More so leaning towards Yubel. Let me know what you think of this kind of discussion. I'm doing this basically because I don't feel confident doing a tier list as of now, because I haven't played these decks enough to compare them to each other directly. Let me know if this is still helpful to you, because I tried to include a lot of thoughts on a lot of decks that I think are viable or not viable. Whether you're going to be playing NAWCQ or EUWCQ or whatever, good luck in Fiendsmith Tier 0 format. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.